The reading this morning is from the letters of Paul to the Romans, and we're reading from Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 25. Present suffering and future glory is the title of this section. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been growing as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present day. Not only so, but we ourselves, who are of the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to the sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Theo, for reading that for us. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, we're going through a series where we're looking at stewardship, how we look after some of the wonderful gifts that God has given us. And today, we're going to look at how we look after, or how we interact with, the wonderful gift of creation. Everything that we see around us, that gift that we have been given, and how we respond to that calling, which, by the way, is our very first calling. There are lots of things that are established as what's asked of us through the sort of creation narrative, but the very first calling is to steward that creation and to look after it. So how do we respond to that? It's in the context of our stewardship of a few other things. So next week we have a all-age service, which we hope you come to, because it would be a really great opportunity to talk about how we respond in general to the gifts that God gives us, and that will be a good time to do so as a church family. But then we'll continue on talking about how we respond to the gifts of financial gifts that we possess, how we respond to what's called the greatest gift that we're given, the gift of the gospel, how we are stewards of that story and how we respond. We're going to talk about how we're stewards of our time and how we give of that. And last week we talked about, and you can still see it on YouTube, last week we talked about how we're stewards of ourselves first and foremost. So how we prepare and steward ourselves so that we might then go on to be stewards of those other things. Now, so last week we were reminded of, when we read that creation narrative, and a couple of things struck me as we did that. The first thing that struck me was how humanity, we, appear in that creation narrative pretty late on. So we go through 26, 27 verses, and then after all of the other parts of creation were mentioned and gone through, that's when we appear. So we appear quite late in the day. And that's important for a couple of reasons. First, yes, we are actually the pinnacle of creation, and so all of those things were created so that we might flourish. And only when that was in place were we put into the story. So that's important to remember. But secondly, God spent an awful lot of time preparing that way. And it didn't just happen by accident. There's a huge amount of intention that goes into the world that we're placed into, and a huge amount of love. And when he looks at it, he says it's good. He says it's good, and he says that over and over again, and then at the very end he says it's very good. And I was asked a really interesting question this morning. Because if we pop up the next sort of slide that shows that creation narrative, we see all of those things in the day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and so on, and then we appear in that day 6 at the end, highlighting hopefully those things that I've just mentioned. Someone said that it may appear with this chart that what we were teaching was that it was created in 6 days, literally. And actually, I've got to say, and I want to make clear, that I have no problem with that. I don't know if that was the intention behind it, because I don't know the theology of the preacher, and I'm happy not to. But if someone believes that God created the world in 6 days, literally as it was laid out in the book of Genesis, I'm okay with that. And the reason I'm okay with that is because if God can't do that, then he's limited in his ability to act. And he's not necessarily a God that's worth following. If he can't decide that this is the way he wants to do it, and that's the pattern that he uses to create all of creation, then I'm okay with people believing that, because actually I believe in a God that can do that, and if I don't believe in a God that can do that, then there's no point in me believing in him, because I'm limiting what he can do, and that is not good. But there's a however. Because I know that there are people who think other than that, and think that what this tells us is a beautiful story full of truth of how God created the world, but not necessarily in 6 literal days, but that those days may account for something else. And I would say exactly the same thing in response. I'm okay with that, because if I think that God can't do that, then I'm limiting God. And that's a really dangerous thing to do. So I'm okay with somebody believing that. And this is something that we need to grapple with and think about. And if you want to talk about it more, then I'd be delighted. I'm not the expert in the room. There'll probably be people who know more about it than I do. But I want to say that whichever of those you fall down onto, I'm okay with that, because what we mustn't do is limit God to not being able to do one or the other. But we must understand that to be God, he can do all things. Now, that is but one rabbit hole we could go down as we talk about creation. Because if you look at all the books that are written about the theology of creation, well, I've got enough on my shelf to take about that much space. If you look at Romans 8, which is the passage that we just heard a little bit from, well, the amount of stuff that is written on Romans 8 probably takes up about that much space as well, because Romans 8 really is the pivot point of Paul's understanding of salvation and recreation and all of those things. But the reason we have that passage read is because, remember I said that when God created, he looked at it and said it was good. Well, that speaks to a time when all things will be restored by God, and he will once again look at it and say it is good. That is why now we are in this time of struggle, it says. That we're in the birth pains, we're experiencing those things where we're waiting for something beautiful to be born, but actually that could be quite painful and a bit of a struggle. It's not an easy thing, and we're in that time right now, where we had something that was good and perfect. And we will do once again, but we are in this time in the middle. And because there are so many things I could therefore talk about, I want to focus on 2 things. The first is I want to try and establish why I believe looking after God's good creation is not just moralistic, it's not just a moral good, but is actually a theological imperative. It is part of our calling as humans and particularly as Christians. So I want to try and establish that first. And then I want to take from that what it might mean for us in terms of our actions. So with a massive field that we could talk about, there's so much, I want to talk about those 2 things. Why is it a theological imperative and not just a sort of morally nice thing to do? And therefore, what does that mean in terms of where we go next with it? And the fact that creation is restored and is looked at and seen as good is a really good place to start. I found a picture online. and we'll pop it up now, of what someone thought of when, how they've read into the new creation, so the new heaven and the new earth, that thing that happens when Jesus returns and restores all things to glory and all things to him. And what's really interesting about this picture is you've got a few things. You've got the light that we're told shines constantly. That's because Jesus is there actually with us. We get to worship him fully and properly. You've got that restoration of creation around, so you've got the beautiful lakes, if you can see that. You've got a couple of rolling hills. You've got all of, I'm sure there's a lot of lovely animals in perfect peace with each other, all there as well. But you've also got a city. And that's because when the Bible talks about what happens next, what happens when Jesus returns, it talks about it in the context of a city. Now, that's interesting because if you look at the first creation, if you look at the Garden of Eden, the one thing that was definitely not there was a city. That tells me that actually in the new creation, something that was not there at the start will be there. So something that we do, because cities are not necessarily acts of God, they're things that we have constructed, something that we do will impact and be present in the new creation. Similarly, it said that we dwelt in amongst creation and that we were happy doing that at the very start. But then we built dwelling places, and we're told that in the new heaven and the new earth there will be places to dwell. Again, that wasn't God, that's us. Something that we have done impacts the new heaven and the new earth. Now that actually makes sense. That makes sense to me because the first fruit of the new creation that we're told that we see is Jesus Christ himself as he's resurrected. Now, Jesus Christ, when he's resurrected, there are a couple of things that are different and interesting about him, and there's something that's the same that he points to, and that's he points to the fact that he has in his hands and in his side scars. God didn't do that. We did that. Something that humanity did impacts into the new creation and is seen as part of that. Now, why am I saying this? Is because I want to impress upon us the fact that actually things that we do now impact into the new creation. Actions that we take will be seen in some way. I don't know how fully, because frankly none of us will until we're there, but we can impact the new creation. So that puts a bit of a pressure, a bit of a question on our actions. Now, as I've said, there are a couple of things that are restored. One of them is the human body, and we're told to prepare ourselves for that new creation. But we're also told, or Paul says, as he's asked, well, can we therefore do anything to the body because it doesn't matter because we'll all be restored? He says, by no means. Our body is a temple. That's where that phrase comes from. Our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, we must act accordingly and look after ourselves in mind and body and spirit, preparing for Jesus' coming. We're also called to prepare other people for Jesus' coming. We're also called to prepare the church for Jesus' coming. And actually, we're called to prepare the church as if the church is a bride waiting for the coming of the bridegroom. Now, how do we prepare a bride? Well, we don't neglect the bride, do we? We don't ignore the bride and give the bride the worst. We give the bride the best, and we make sure the bride has everything the bride needs for the coming of the groom. We're called to prepare those things. And similarly, we're called to prepare creation for his coming. So there is an argument that I've heard a couple of times about creation that, well, God will restore it all, and therefore it doesn't matter what we do now, because God will restore it all. And actually, the reason I've gone through those other things that we need to prepare for the new creation is because we wouldn't say that about anything else, would we? We wouldn't say that about ourselves. I can do anything I want to my body or my mind because God is going to restore it all. We wouldn't allow ourselves to abuse our bodies in that way. We wouldn't say that of other people, would we? We wouldn't abuse people thinking, well, it's absolutely fine because God's going to restore it. We would never do that. Hopefully, we wouldn't do it with his church. Hopefully, we wouldn't therefore do it with his creation. So whilst only God will redeem all things and restore all things, we must take seriously our responsibility to prepare creation for his coming. It's not just moralistic. It's actually part of our calling as Christians. Now, some much cleverer people than me sat together and thought about, well, what is our calling as a church? What are we actually called to do? What marks of a church exist so that we could say, yes, those people are acting as a church? And they put down, going right back to very early meetings of the early church that established its sort of bounds and responsibilities, and they put down 5 marks of the mission of a church. I want to go through those. I want to see how many you think are serious priorities for the church, because these technically are our 5. The first is to proclaim the good news of the kingdom. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I'm happy to get an amen, but it's okay. Thank you. To teach, baptize, and nurture new believers. That sounds like something we should be doing. To respond to human need by loving service. To seek to transform unjust structures of society and to challenge violence of every kind and to pursue peace. That sounds like something the church should be doing. And here's the 5th. To strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew life on earth. The 5th mark of the mission of the church, set in the context of all of those wonderful and hugely important things. What I'm trying to say here and establish, as I said at the start, looking after God's creation is not just a moralistic good that we might do or not do depending on where we sit. It's our very first calling as humanity. It's something that we're called to do because we're called to restore it and prepare the world for Jesus coming again. And it is a mark of the church and one of our responsibilities. Now, therefore, how do we respond? Well, I think we have to therefore consider our actions. We consider the impact that our lives have on creation. How our actions change things. And when we consider that because actually our actions change things not just for us, but that 3rd mark of mission in terms of structures of injustice, our actions in terms of the climate impact the poorest people in our world more than anybody else. So it's a justice issue as well. And therefore, when we think to act, we must think to act in a way that minimizes any bad and maximizes the good. Now, what I'm not going to do this morning is talk about boilers and solar panels and all of the bases, the nuts and the bolts. That's not where I want to go, because actually all of those decisions are dependent on where you are, and we're all in completely different places and able to do completely different things. So it's the principle, therefore, that I want to try and put across. What's required of us in response to understanding this is our calling? Well, we must minimize the bad and maximize the good. We must lessen our impact on the environment and consider every action that we take as part of our calling to prepare it for Christ's coming. One of the things that helps me do that is the language that we're called to be stewards. It's that very first thing that we're called to be. We're called to be stewards. Stewards are not owners. If I have stewardship of something, it means that somewhere else there is someone who has put this in my charge and they are the owner of it. Thankfully, in Psalm 24, we're told who the owner is. It says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." That solidifies my responsibility as not just being something that I act on for my own good, but as part of my calling in terms of looking after something that I've been given charge of. As I said, there's so much that we can talk about in terms of the stewardship of the environment that we've been given. It is a wonderful gift, and we are told to make use of that gift, so we should use the resources that we've been given. But I think it's a theological imperative and not just a moral thing to look after it well. I think it's part of our calling to prepare it for Christ's coming again. And I think, therefore, we have a question as to what our actions are in response to that. So I'm going to ask the song worship team to come up, because they're going to help us reflect, and they're going to try and set a mood of doing so. Because our response to each of these stewardship issues has to therefore be, well, okay, if this is what the case is, I need to be able to respond in some way. So what is it that I might be being asked to do? And that's what I want us to do. They're going to play a song, and please do feel free to sing along to that song, to stand, but I'm going to suggest that we stay seated for the first one particularly. And I want you to reflect on, well, okay, if I do agree, you don't have to agree. Lots of people tell me at the end of a service why they don't. If you do agree, sorry, that was off-piste and a joke. If you do agree that this is something that we're called to do, and if you do agree, therefore, that we need to think of our actions, I want you to consider what your actions might be this week. What might we be able to change in ourselves in terms of how we respond to God's creation? How might we lessen our impact for bad, maximize our impact for good? But ultimately, how might we work with God's creation to prepare it for his coming? We're going to do that by listening to or singing along with our first song, and then I'll come and we'll pray before we continue in song worship. But let's spend this time with God. And if you'd like someone to pray with you through those things, then please do come to the back, where hopefully there'll be someone to pray with you and help you think through those things. But let's consider our response and continue to worship. Thanks.